Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we're diving into something that's so relevant, it's almost frustrating, and that's the topic of ADHD in women. And to help us unpack all of this, we're looking at a really interesting article from the Outside, a Substack, by the way, that focuses on neurodiversity and gender identity. But okay, the title of this article is kind of telling, don't you think? Shocking news, ADHD exists in women, science confirms.
It is, and it's pretty blunt about it, too. I think
Oh,
that's part of the point the article is trying to make. For a lot of people, this isn't exactly breaking news.
exactly, and we'll circle back to that. But first, for anyone who might be new to this, when we say neurodiversity, what are we talking about? Essentially, it's this idea that brains work differently, and things like ADHD or autism, those are just variations, not disorders. But okay, so this article digs into a recent study, and the headline finding, and I'm quoting here, is women are diagnosed with ADHD an average of 4 years later than men. 4 years. That's not insignificant.
Not at all. And think about it this way. Imagine going through those really important developmental years like adolescence or early adulthood without understanding why you might be struggling with certain things, focus, organization, even emotional regulation, all these things that are often linked to ADHD.
So then what are the real-world consequences of that kind of delay?
Well, on a personal level, it can be incredibly frustrating. Imagine feeling like you're constantly trying to swim upstream, but you have no idea why. That can really do a number on your self-esteem, your relationships, even your academic and career paths. And then there's the increased chance of being misdiagnosed.
Because if you don't realize it's ADHD, then those symptoms might get attributed to something else entirely.
Exactly. And that's where the study's finding about anxiety and mood disorders is interesting. The study found that women with ADHD were twice as likely to be diagnosed with these conditions as well. Now, this doesn't mean ADHD causes anxiety or depression, but it can definitely contribute to it.
It's like when you're trying to force a square peg into a round hole, right? If you don't realize the peg is the wrong shape, you just keep banging your head against the wall, wondering why it's not working.
That's a great way to put it. And that feeling misunderstood, like your experiences aren't valid, can be incredibly isolating and really take a toll emotionally.
And this is where that shocking news headline really hits home, right?
Absolutely. It really reflects the frustration so many women feel, women who have been unheard, dismissed, or misdiagnosed for years. For them, this research isn't really new information. It's more like a validation of what they've been saying all along.
It's like science is finally catching up to what so many people already knew.
Exactly.
But we do have to acknowledge that this study, like many studies, has limitations.
Yeah, and understanding these nuances is really important when we're talking about research. So this particular study relied on public registry data. That means it only looked at people who were formally diagnosed and had that information put into the system.
So it's not accounting for everyone who might be flying under the radar, never diagnosed, or maybe even misdiagnosed.
Right, and there's another thing. It didn't look at how severe the ADHD symptoms were for each person. And that can really vary.
Can you talk about why that's so important?
Sure, imagine two people, both diagnosed with ADHD, but their experiences are really different. One person might have mild inattentiveness that they can manage pretty easily with some lifestyle changes, but the other person might have severe hyperactivity and impulsivity that really impacts their daily life in significant ways. If you don't capture that range of experiences, it's really tough to draw any definitive conclusions or say that these findings apply to a larger group.
So it's not a perfect picture, but it still offers some really valuable insights. And what I find so interesting is how this article takes these findings, these data points, and puts them into a larger social context. It's not just about the numbers themselves, but what those numbers represent.
I completely agree, and that's something we're going to discuss a lot more as we go further into this deep dive.
And this is where talking about lived experience becomes so important, because for so many women, trying to get an ADHD diagnosis can feel like an uphill battle. They're overlooked, misunderstood, even dismissed.
Exactly, and I think it's helpful to look at the historical context here. Even if it's not exactly a happy history, psychiatry, like a lot of fields, hasn't always been the most inclusive or representative.
Yeah, you immediately think of how hysteria was used as a diagnosis for women for centuries.
Exactly. That is a perfect example of how societal biases can actually work their way into medical practices. For literally centuries, women's emotions, their behavior, it was often seen as pathological. And those same standards just weren't applied to men, and unfortunately we still see traces of that today.
So when a woman goes to a doctor and presents with symptoms that might point to ADHD, difficulty concentrating, feeling overwhelmed, struggling with their emotions, those symptoms might be viewed differently.
In a way, yes, and I'm not saying that every healthcare provider is intentionally biased, but those historical patterns, those ingrained assumptions about how a woman should act, they can create blind spots.
And that leads us to another really crucial point in this article, and that's the experience of trans individuals. This study found that trans individuals were 6 times more likely to be neurodivergent. That's a shocking statistic. Yeah. Do we know what contributes to such a higher prevalence?
It's a really complicated question, and honestly, researchers are still trying to figure out all the factors.
Yeah.
But one theory is that for some neurodivergent individuals, especially those who are assigned female at birth, they might be more likely to question their gender identity as well.
Because those traditional expectations of what it means to be a girl or a woman don't feel right.
Yes, and this also ties into the idea of masking, which is something a lot of neurodivergent people do, no matter their gender identity, to try to fit in.
Masking. Can you explain that a little?
Sure. So masking is basically this effort, and it can be conscious or subconscious,
Okay.
to suppress or hide your natural behaviors, even your personality traits.
Mm-hmm.
And you're doing it to try to align with these social norms.
So if you're constantly being told that you're too much or too emotional or too different, you learn to change, to blend in.
Right. And masking can be a helpful way to cope in certain situations, but it can also come at a cost. It can be really exhausting, for one, and it can lead to feelings of isolation, like you're not being your true self, even self-loathing.
Because essentially you're living a life that isn't true to who you really are.
Exactly. And for trans individuals, this whole experience of masking might be even more intense.
Because they're not only dealing with the expectations of their assigned gender, but also all the societal pressures to conform to these very rigid ideas of what it means to be male or female.
Precisely. So you can see how all of this, gender identity, neurodiversity, how these layers intersect and create unique challenges. And unfortunately, our healthcare systems aren't always equipped to deal with that level of complexity.
Which is why this article is pushing for some pretty major changes, right? It's not enough to just say, oh yeah, we see there's a problem here. We have to actually do something about it.
I completely agree. And I think one of the most important areas to focus on is updating how we diagnose ADHD.
You mean like, are the current diagnostic criteria too narrow?
They tend to be, yes. They often rely on that more traditional idea of ADHD,
Right.
which, as we've been talking about, is usually based on a hyperactive young boy.
And that image, that stereotype, is incredibly limiting because it just doesn't capture the full range of how ADHD can show up, especially in women and people assigned female at birth.
Exactly. So we need diagnostic criteria that are more inclusive, more sensitive to all the different ways ADHD might present across genders.
And beyond that, the article also mentions the need for better training for healthcare providers.
Oh, absolutely. Because it's not just about what questions you're asking patients, but how you ask those questions and then how you understand the answers you get.
It's about making sure patients feel safe to talk about what they're going through openly and honestly without feeling judged or dismissed.
Exactly. And that means healthcare providers need to be knowledgeable about ADHD in all its forms. But they also need to be aware of their own potential biases.
So it's about having the knowledge, but also the empathy. It's about truly listening to patients, taking their concerns seriously, and working together to figure out the best way forward.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. And I think that's a really good place to transition into, what we can actually do with this information.
Absolutely.
Because the article, it ends kind of on a funny note. Like, the writer jokes that researchers should look into easier questions now that this one's been solved. And they put solved in quotes.
Right. Yeah.
It's obviously a little tongue-in-cheek, but the message is serious. We can't just keep stating the obvious and acting like that's enough. It's about actually using this knowledge to make real changes.
Exactly. And for our listeners, maybe for some of you, this is really hitting home. You're listening to all of this and thinking, yeah, that sounds familiar. Now what? So what advice would you give to anyone out there who might be in that boat?
I think the most important thing is to remember you are not alone. When you're struggling with something you don't fully understand, it can be easy to feel isolated. But these findings just underscore how common these experiences are, especially for women.
Yeah, it's like that, well, duh moment. But now it's backed up by actual research. And I think that validation is huge.
It really is, and it can be what pushes you to take those next steps. If you think you might have ADHD, talk to a qualified healthcare professional, someone who really knows their stuff about ADHD in women.
And how do you even find someone like that?
That's a great question. You can ask friends for recommendations or search specifically for specialists in your area. A lot of them will mention neurodiversity on their websites or in their bios. Because, unfortunately, as we've been talking about, not all healthcare providers are going to have the same level of understanding when it comes to diagnosing and treating ADHD, especially in people who don't fit that stereotypical image.
Right, okay, so you found someone. What's next?
Well, don't be afraid to advocate for yourself. Come prepared to your appointments. Maybe even bring this episode or the article we talked about. Use them as a starting point for the conversation. And if you feel dismissed or like you're not being heard, get a second opinion.
You deserve to have a healthcare provider who listens to you and takes your concerns seriously and wants to work with you to find the best way forward. Because there is no one-size-fits-all approach.
That's so important to remember. And in the meantime, while you're on that journey of finding a diagnosis and finding the right support, remember that knowledge is power. There are so many incredible resources and online communities dedicated to ADHD in women.
Yes. It can make all the difference to connect with other people who just get it,
You really can.
Like, no need to over-explain, no need to justify anything, just shared understanding and support.
Exactly. Because sometimes, honestly, that feeling of belonging, that sense of community, can be just as valuable as any diagnosis.
It really is about finding those spaces where when you say, well, duh, people nod in agreement, not look at you like you're speaking a different language, and you're in this space where your experiences are validated and you feel empowered to navigate the world in a way that feels authentically you.
I love that. That's a great way to put it.
So to wrap things up, while the journey might have its ups and downs, it's important to know that you're not alone. There's support out there every step of the way.
Well said.
And to all of you listening, we really hope this deep dive has given you some food for thought, maybe even empowered you in some small way. So until next time, keep those amazing brains of yours buzzing, and we'll see you all soon.